Step 11, crossing the Red Sea. Exodus chapter 14, verse 1 to chapter 15, verse 19.
Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you took us away to die in the wilderness?
Why must we die?
Fear not! Stand still and see the salvation of the Lord.
The pillar of fire!
It is the breath of God!
Great one, you cannot breach the fire of God.
Gather your families and your flocks. We must go with all speed.
Yes. Go where? To drown in the sea? How long will the fire hold Pharaoh back?
Will it hold?
After this day, you shall see his chariots no more.
No! You'll be dead under them.
The Lord of hosts will do battle for us. Behold his mighty hand.
God opens the sea with the blast of his nostrils.
Lead them through the midst of the waters. His will be done.
He opens the waters before them, and he bars our way with fire. Let us go from this place. Men cannot fight against a god.
Better to die in battle with a god than live in shame.
Praise God and down into it! Does your life worth so much?
Stop that wagon! Fire dies.
Sound the pursuit. This is work for a butcher, not a pharaoh. Destroy them all, but bring Moses to me alive.
Rebels, here! Hard!
Chariot! Ah! Run! Run! Run behind! Run!
Better to serve the Egyptians than to die here.
Who shall withstand the power of God? Thou didst blow with thy winds, and the sea covered them. Who is like unto thee, O Lord? From everlasting to everlasting, thou art God.
The story of the crossing of the Red Sea is a pivotal moment for the Hebrew people. Their situation seemed impossible, an army on one side, a sea on the other. Even the solution required a huge amount of risk: to walk into the seabed, to see the water on either side, to know that a great army is following behind. To walk with only a small path lying ahead, wondering whether the waves would crash back into place when you were in the middle of the sea, or whether the army would finally catch up when you had nowhere to run. There is little wonder that this event holds such a central place in the memory of the Hebrew people and all who treasure their scriptures. Few of us experience such a dramatic act of God, but many of us will have times when we are beset and beleaguered on all sides, and when the path ahead seems very narrow and dangerous. But If we hold firm and take the risk of faith, we find that eventually we are brought safe to the other side.
When have you had the experience of having to follow a narrow, dark and dangerous path through a crisis in your own life? How did you feel as you traveled it? Where was God?
Step 12. Oasis. Exodus. Chapter 15, verse 26 to 27. It tells us about when they were told by the Lord that if they would yield obedience to His commandments, they should be free from the diseases the Egyptians had been afflicted with. The chapter is concluded with their coming to Elim, where they found 12 wells of water and 70 palm trees, and there encamped.
After the trauma of leaving Egypt, the crossing of the Red Sea, the people need time to rest. They arrive at Elim and camp by the water of the 12 springs and 70 palm trees. When we have gone through pain and trial, or even just had a difficult day, we too need time to rest and be refreshed.
When have you had times of blessed rest? Take time today to rest by waters, even if that is only a soak in a bath. Reflect on the times when God has given you peace and rest. When you sleep, be aware that you sleep in the love of God.
Step 13. Bread from heaven. Exodus chapter 16, verses 1 to 36. It speaks about the children of Israel who were out of Egypt and in the wilderness of Sin, in between Sinai and Elim. They quickly forgot the mercies that God had shown them in the hands of Pharaoh and were now complaining to Moses and Aaron. They even exaggerated that it was much better in Egypt, where they ate meat and bread freely and in comfort. The Lord heard the Israelites grumbling and offered quail in the evening and manna in the morning to them. The quantity was just supposed to be sufficient for a day's fill. Some of the Israelites still had trouble following God's instruction. They gathered more manna on the Sabbath day, despite His directives. God then commanded Moses to keep a 2-quart jar of the manna, so future generations would remember what God offered them. Since it tasted like wafers made with honey, it kept reminding the Israelites of how the promised land would be like every day for the 40 years they ate it.
It does not take long for the Hebrew people to forget what God has done and to look back wistfully for the times of plenty in Egypt. God hears their complaints and promises that they will not starve in the desert, but will eat their fill twice a day, bread in the morning, quail in the evening. Nostalgia can be a dangerous thing. Looking back to the past can be a blessing. But we run the risk of seeing everything as better then and failing to see the gifts around us in the present. The people had no experience of living in the desert. Anything they had wanted in Egypt, they bought or grew. Could it have been that both manna and quails were already there, and that God had to point out that He had provided food? All they had to do was see it and use it. We too can spend so long looking back to the golden days and forward to a rosy future that we wonder why living in the present does not match up. We too need to look and see what God has given to us. Gifts under our very noses that we have failed to see and use to enrich our lives.
Those who follow a Eucharistic tradition center their worship on sharing bread and wine, seeing in them the ultimate gift of God. Reflect on the food you eat. If you are what you eat, what are you?
Step 14. Water from rock. Exodus chapter 17, verses 1 to 7. Leaving the desert of sin, where God's miraculous provision of manna had commenced, the Israelites went from place to place as the Lord directed them. The events of chapter 17 occur while Israel is camped at Rephidim, where there was no water for the Israelites or their cattle. It is important to note that it was God who led Israel to Rephidim, where there was no water. It is bad enough that the Israelites argued with Moses and demanded that Moses provide them with water. But the text informs us that they were also challenging God here as well. Moses accused the people of putting God to the test in their quarreling with him. As commanded, Moses took along his staff, the same one with which he had struck the Nile. The Lord promised Moses that he would be standing before him at the rock at Horeb. Moses was to strike the rock, causing water to flow from it. When Moses did this, water came forth in abundance, providing for the needs of the Israelites.
Water is one of the most basic requirements for human living. And the wilderness can be unforgiving for people who are unused to knowing where to look for it. The people react in the all too familiar way. It is Moses' fault. It is God's fault. Why aren't they sorting things out more efficiently? Moses is obviously beginning to get more than a little tired of this and asks God what on earth he is supposed to do with these people. God again gives a sign that proves irrefutably that he will not allow his people to perish in the desert. In the eyes of all the elders, Moses strikes a rock with his staff, and pure water flows, enough and more for the people of God to drink. Dryness is a part of the spiritual journey. There can be many causes, some of which we can deal with, and some of which require a patient waiting upon God. There is a temptation to cast around and find someone to blame, even if the someone is ourselves. Whilst there are times when we are at fault, there are others when it is simply that God is working at a lower level within us than we can be aware of. We have to wait until the moment when God invites us to strike the rock that is our soul and find that the well springs have been waiting to burst forth anew.
When have you experienced spiritual dryness? How was it resolved? Where was God?
Step 15. Sharing the Lord. Exodus chapter 17, verses 8 to 13. Israel engaged with Amalek in their own necessary defense. Joshua fights. Moses prays. Both minister to Israel. The rod was held up as the banner to encourage the soldiers.
The power of prayer is shown to the people as Moses prays over the battlefield until eventually Amalek is defeated. However, even such a powerful prayer grew weary. His arms became too heavy, and for a time it looked as if this weakness would lead to defeat for Israel. This was when the help of Aaron and Hur proved vital. As Moses grew tired, they supported him with their own strength, keeping him steady until victory was won. There are times in our own lives when our own resources begin to feel exhausted. We feel prayed out. We know that prayer is needed, but are too weary to do it alone. At such times, the support of family and friends and our communities is vital. They can sustain and support us through the dark times and rejoice with us when the better times finally come.
When have you had to lean on the prayer of others? Who were they? Have you thanked them and thanked God for them?
Step 16, consecration. Exodus chapter 19, verses 1 to 9. On the third new moon, after the Israelites had gone out of the land of Egypt, on that very day, they came into the wilderness of Sinai. They had journeyed from Rephidim, entered the wilderness of Sinai, and camped in the wilderness. Israel camped there in front of the mountain. Then Moses went up to God. The Lord called to him from the mountain, saying, "Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob, and tell the Israelites, you have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now therefore, if you obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession out of all the peoples. Indeed, the whole earth is mine. But you shall be for me a priestly kingdom and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the Israelites." So Moses came, summoned the elders of the people, and set before them all these words that the Lord had commanded him. The people all answered as one, "Everything that the Lord has spoken, we will do." Moses reported the words of the people to the Lord. Then the Lord said to Moses, "I am going to come to you in a dense cloud, in order that the people may hear when I speak with you, and so trust you ever after."
The people of God still had a long way to go and a lot to learn. But God sees in them the potential to be his treasured possession, a priestly kingdom, a holy nation. He consecrates them to himself. They had done little to deserve such an honor. Their departure from Egypt and the journey since had been characterized by argument and complaint. No one deserves consecration. No one can earn God's blessing. It is freely given, and often holiness is a response to God's love rather than being a prerequisite for it. We too are chosen for holiness, not because we are already good, but because God sees in us the potential to be his eternal treasure. How we respond to that love is up to us. God will never force consecration upon us. He invites, loves, calls us to be his own, but the choice to respond or not is ours.
How aware are you of being part of God's treasured possession? How do you react to knowing that you are consecrated and called to holiness?
Step 17, living the covenant. Exodus chapter 31, verses 12 to 18. The Lord said to Moses, "You yourself are to speak to the Israelites. You shall keep my Sabbaths, for this is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, given in order that you may know that I, the Lord, sanctify you. You shall keep the Sabbath, because it is holy for you. Every one who profanes it shall be put to death. Whoever does any work on it shall be cut off from among the people. 6 days shall work be done, but the seventh day is a Sabbath of solemn rest, holy to the Lord. Whoever does any work on the Sabbath day shall be put to death. Therefore, the Israelites shall keep the Sabbath, observing the Sabbath throughout their generations as a perpetual covenant. It is a sign forever between me and the people of Israel, that in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, and on the seventh day he rested and was refreshed."
The section selected for reading comes at the end of the long detailed instructions given to Moses concerning how this new people are to conduct their lives. It begins with the 10 Commandments and goes on to describe how the people are to order their affairs and how they are to worship God. The whole of their lives, down to the smallest detail, is to witness to the fact of their being a people living in covenant with God. And on one day each week, they were to be holy gods. Work was to be set aside, and they were to be refreshed and renewed in worshiping the God who had liberated them. We are inheritors of the covenant, and we too are called to witness to that in every detail of our lives. Our Sunday worship is essential, a time to celebrate the perpetual covenant between us and God. But the covenant is not limited to Sundays.
How well do you keep the Sabbath? How does the detail of your life bear witness to your living in covenant with God?
Step 18, making God manageable. Exodus chapter 32, verses 1 to 33. It describes the people of Israel who, being adamant at the delay of Moses' coming down the mountain, Aaron is approached to make idols for these people. In the meantime, we hear about the conversation between God and Moses and how he gives the 2 tablets of the testimony. The reading goes on to explain how Moses confronts Aaron about the sin of the golden calf and defies the sin of the people. The passage concludes illustrating the firm words of God, keeping out of his books all who have sinned and gone away from him.
How much time had gone by since God had consecrated the Hebrew people to himself and appointed them a priestly and holy nation? And how quickly had the people forgotten? They knew about gods that could be seen and touched, who could be carried where they wanted it to go. They were less sure about a God who was so obviously had a mind of his own. It was far easier to offer gold and create an image they could manage than offer themselves to a God who was beyond their control. We may not make golden calves, but we often succumb to the temptation of creating other gods and investing them with the power to save us. We offer them our gold, our time, our energy, forgetting the one who really has the power to save us, heal us, liberate us.
What are the gods of our own society? Which have you found yourself getting caught up with, willingly or by default? Where was God?
Step 19, radiant in God's love. Exodus chapter 34, verses 29 to 33. Moses came down from Mount Sinai. As he came down from the mountain with the 2 tablets of the covenant in his hand, Moses did not know that the skin of his face shone because he had been talking with God. When Aaron and all the Israelites saw Moses, the skin of his face was shining, and they were afraid to come near him. But Moses called to them, and Aaron and all the leaders of the congregation returned to him, and Moses spoke with them. Afterward, all the Israelites came near, and he gave them in commandment all that the Lord had spoken with him on Mount Sinai. When Moses had finished speaking with them, he put a veil on his face.
No one can encounter God without it showing. For Moses, the encounter was revealed in the radiance reflecting in his face, so bright that he had to keep it veiled. Such radiance is often represented on images of Christ, Mary, and the saints as a halo of light around their heads. Most of us cannot aspire to such an obvious sign of God's love for us, and many of us would find it quite embarrassing to have attention drawn to ourselves in that way. However, we can catch glimpses of what lies at the heart of the halo and the shining face. Just occasionally, we sense a glow, a warmth, a deep reassurance, and sense of joy. We can be quite surprised when we come back to this reality to see how things seem, or we may find that we see them as also reflecting something of the glory of God. The mystics often give such insights into a world that speaks of the grandeur of our God.
When have you experienced a glow or sense of being taken out of yourself, either in prayer or by an encounter with someone or something? Where was God?
Step 20, creating a tent of God's presence. Exodus chapter 37, verses 1 to 7. Bezalel made the ark of acacia wood. It was 2.5 cubits long, 1.5 cubits wide, and 1.5 cubits high. He overlaid it with pure gold inside and outside, and made a molding of gold around it. He cast for it 4 rings of gold for its 4 feet, 2 rings on its one side and 2 rings on its other side. He made poles of acacia wood and overlaid them with gold, and put the poles into the rings on the sides of the ark to carry the ark. He made a mercy seat of pure gold. 2.5 cubits was its length, and 1.5 cubits its width. He made 2 cherubim of hammered gold. At the 2 ends of the mercy seat, he made them.
When it came to creating the tabernacle, Moses does not demand that people give what is required. Rather, he makes it a matter of offering what hearts and spirits suggest. As a consequence, the offering proves to be so great that in the end, he has to stop the people bringing more. It is appropriate that offerings for the tabernacle should be generous. This was the God who had liberated them and who was forming them into a people. This was the place where God was to show his glory to his people, to mark his presence among them. Beauty and craftsmanship are powerful signs of our being made in the image of God. God is the supreme creator, and our creativity, his gift to us. To spend time and energy on creating something for God can be one of the purest forms of worship. Allowing our minds and spirits to inspire our work invests it with generosity, love, and adoration that makes our creation eminently pleasing to God.
When have you created something beautiful for God? Allow your heart and spirit to stir within you and see what they inspire you to create for the glory of God.
Step 21. Living in the glory of God.
The presence of God in the cloud stayed with the Hebrew people at every stage of their journey. For 40 years they were to wander, but always in the knowledge that their God traveled with them. God revealed himself as a pilgrim God, not a static God confined to places or buildings. This was the God who had revealed himself to Abraham, leading him on his own journey. This is the God who reveals himself to us on our journey, a God who accompanies us, yet remains completely other, a God who loves and guides, challenges and surprises us.
How can you develop an awareness of living in the promise of glory? What difference will this make to the way you live the rest of your life?